May 1945. Germany had fallen, but the rain never stopped. It beat against tin roofs and broken glass as if trying to wash something no water could ever cleanse. In a small detention camp near Lüneburg, silence replaced gunfire. Rows of captured women stood waiting. Former Wehrmacht auxiliaries, secretaries, radio operators, faces pale, uniforms soaked, hearts emptied. They expected vengeance. They expected cruelty, because that's what they'd been told enemies do. But when her turn came, 26-year-old Greta Muller didn't meet hatred. A British sergeant simply poured a cup of tea, slid it across the table, and said, "You'll want to sit." Processing takes time. That moment broke her more than any punishment could, because pain was familiar, mercy was not. Kindness from an enemy felt like stepping into light after living too long underground. It hurt to see clearly again. This isn't a story about victory or revenge. It's about what survives when hate finally runs out, and how one cup of tea, offered without malice, became the quietest and most dangerous weapon of all. May 17th, 1945, 14:23 hours. Rain fell like it had forgotten how to stop. The war had been over for 9 days, but no one in that camp near Lüneburg believed in endings anymore. The corrugated roof shook under the downpour, the sound sharp and metallic, echoing through the wooden barracks where a line of captured women waited in silence. The air smelled of wet earth, diesel fuel, and disinfectant. A single hanging bulb flickered above a desk, where a British sergeant wrote in a ledger with careful, almost reverent precision. His handwriting was slow and deliberate. Each name he wrote seemed like another brick in the wall that separated the living from the past. Greta Muller stood near the end of the line. Her Wehrmacht auxiliary uniform, gray, soaked through, clung to her skin. The fabric smelled like smoke and mud, and old fear. Her boots were caked in the same dirt that had buried everything she believed in. She didn't move, didn't speak, just watched the man behind the desk. When her turn came, he finally looked up. He wasn't cruel, he wasn't kind either, just exhausted. His eyes were rimmed with red, his jaw covered in a day's stubble. He gestured toward the interpreter, a thin woman in a British uniform with a neutral face. "Name?" the interpreter asked in German. Greta's throat was dry. "Greta Muller." The interpreter repeated it in English. The sergeant nodded, wrote it down, then set the pen aside. For a moment he studied her, as if trying to decide what kind of human being might hide behind that uniform. Then, without a word, he reached for a dented kettle, poured steaming liquid into a tin cup, and slid it across the table. "Tea," he said slowly, the word clumsy on his tongue. "You'll want to sit." Processing takes time. Greta hesitated. Steam curled from the cup. Real tea, not the bitter ersatz, bark, and chicory mix they'd been forced to drink for years. Her fingers trembled as she took it. The heat shocked her palms. The scent pulled something loose in her chest. This didn't make sense. She had expected a slap, a shove, a sneer. She'd been told that capture meant humiliation, that the British were vengeful, decadent, weak men who hid cruelty behind smiles. But here was this soldier, an enemy, offering warmth in a world that had gone cold. She sat. The chair creaked beneath her weight. Outside rain struck the tin roof like a drumbeat. She sipped. The liquid burned her tongue, but she didn't care. It was the first real taste of civilization she'd had in months. She wanted to cry, but she didn't remember how. When the nurse called her name, she was led to a makeshift medical tent. Canvas walls, wooden tables, jars of antiseptic lined like soldiers. A British Army nurse stood waiting, clipboard in hand. Her sleeves were rolled up, her face pale but calm. "Sit," the interpreter said again. Greta obeyed. The examination was routine. Temperature, eyes, throat, hands. But when the nurse reached toward her shoulder, Greta flinched hard, expecting a blow. The nurse froze, raised both palms. "I'm checking for lice," she said softly. "That's all. I won't hurt you." The words were simple. The tone mattered more. It wasn't pity. It was procedure, delivered with quiet dignity. And that dignity was what undid her. When the nurse found a shallow cut on Greta's arm, barbed wire, 2 days old, she cleaned it carefully, wrapped it in a bandage that smelled faintly of soap and alcohol. "You'll need to keep this clean," she said. "Come back in 3 days." 3 days, as if Greta had a future. The camp held nearly 1,000 women. Most were clerks, typists, weather observers, Wehrmacht helpers, they'd been called. They wore gray uniforms and guilt. Some still clung to pride, others to silence. But they all carried the same fear. That decency was a trap. Days bled together. Rain, bells, roll call. Meals served with military precision. Porridge, bread, tea. The women ate in silence, watching British soldiers through lowered eyes. The guards spoke softly, gave clear orders, punished no one. It was unbearable. Because cruelty she could endure. Cruelty confirmed what she believed. Kindness demanded explanation. Greta was assigned clerical work in the administrative office. Her supervisor was Lieutenant Hargrave, a bespectacled man with thin lips and a patience that made her uneasy. "These go by date," he said once, gesturing to a stack of forms. Then alphabetically. She nodded, began to sort. Her fingers shook. When she misfiled an entire folder, she waited for the explosion. Hargrave only sighed, slid the folder back toward her, and said, "Try again." Happens to all of us, that was worse than being yelled at. It meant she was still being treated as a person, and that was something she no longer knew how to be. At night, lying in the barracks, Greta listened to quiet sobs echoing through the darkness. Some women cried out of relief, others from shame. For months they'd been braced for punishment. But when it never came, the silence itself became unbearable. One evening, rain stopped. For the first time in weeks, sunlight filtered through the high windows, dust glowing like smoke in the air. Greta sat on her cot, holding her bandaged arm. The wound had healed. The nurse had been right. "Come back in 3 days," she'd said. She had, and every time the nurse had greeted her the same way, calm, professional, polite. Not once had she asked, "What did you do?" By late summer, the camp began something new. Re-education. The word sounded like punishment, another attempt at breaking them. But it wasn't lectures. It was film. They were led into the recreation hall, 50 women in a row of wooden chairs. The projector rattled, flickered, came to life. The first images were gray and shaky. Piles of bodies, skeletal survivors, hollow faces staring into the lens. Bergen-Belsen, Dachau. Names they had heard only as whispers. Greta couldn't breathe. She had told herself those rumors were lies, enemy propaganda. Now, on that trembling screen, the truth was undeniable. She felt heat rise in her throat, but no tears came. Guilt doesn't cry. It sinks, heavy and wordless. When the film ended, a British officer stood at the front. "This," he said quietly, "is what you served. Not all of you knew, but all of you enabled it. No shouting, no condemnation, just the truth, delivered with surgical precision." That night, voices clashed in the barracks. "It's fake," said Ursula, the radio operator. "Staged by the British." "My cousin saw Dachau," whispered Helga, trembling. "She told me things I didn't believe." "I should have. We followed orders," Ursula spat. "We had no choice." Greta looked up from her cot. "We had a choice," she said softly. "We chose not to ask." Silence fell, and in that silence something shifted. Small, but irreversible. In the days that followed, Greta watched the British officers with new eyes. They enforced rules, yes, they were strict, but they weren't cruel. Their order wasn't built on fear. It was built on a kind of moral gravity, the sense that civilization still mattered even after the world had burned. She realized then what the propaganda had never taught her, that strength wasn't the loudest voice in the room. It was the quiet one that refused to lose its humanity. At night, she lay awake, listening to the rhythm of rain on the roof. It no longer sounded like punishment. It sounded like something trying, desperately, to wash the world clean. By August 1945, northern Germany had gone quiet in a way that didn't feel natural. No air raid sirens, no marching boots, just wind through broken windows, and the crows that had learned to live off war. The women in British custody were slowly being moved, some to hospitals, others to farms that needed labor. Greta's name appeared on the list taped to the notice board. Low-risk personnel. Agricultural reassignment. She didn't know what low risk meant. Maybe that she had been useless enough to survive. The transport truck smelled of diesel and rain-soaked wool. Through the slats in the wooden sides, she watched the German landscape slide by. Villages flattened to stone, fields where bomb craters filled with water, an entire nation rotting beneath the summer sun. When the truck crossed into the British zone and kept going toward the sea, the air changed. The ruins thinned out. England began like a painting that hadn't been finished yet, too green, too gentle to be real. They arrived at a small railway station where a corporal read off names. Greta's was followed by a single destination, Hampshire Civilian Farm Work Detail. The corporal didn't bother with threats or warnings. He just handed her a worn suitcase that wasn't hers and pointed toward a waiting jeep. 2 hours later, the jeep stopped at the end of a dirt lane lined with hedges. A stone farmhouse stood in the mist, chimney breathing pale smoke. A woman in her 60s waited at the door, arms folded, eyes like polished flint. "Mrs. Waywright," the corporal said. "This one's yours." He saluted lazily and drove away. No guards, no fence, just a field of cows staring through drizzle. Mrs. Waywright's voice cut through the damp. "You know how to milk a cow?" Greta shook her head. "You'll learn." She turned and disappeared inside. The first morning nearly broke her. The air was cold enough to bite. She fumbled with the stool, with the pail, with the living warmth of an animal that trusted her less than she trusted herself. When she spilled half the milk, Mrs. Waywright didn't shout, just said, "Tomorrow you'll do better," and walked away. That sentence hurt more than any insult. At noon she was called into the kitchen. Bread, cheese, and a pot of black tea waited on the table. Greta hovered near the doorway until the older woman said simply, "Sit." So she sat. They ate in silence, the only sound the clock ticking above the stove. Halfway through the meal, a man entered, gray hair, heavy shoulders, farmer's hands. He nodded at Greta. "Lost our boy at Arnhem," he said, lowering himself into a chair. "Paratrooper." Greta froze, words tangled in her throat. "I'm sorry," she managed. He looked at her for a long moment, then said, "Wasn't your fault. Wasn't ours either. Just the war." He took a slow bite of bread. That was the end of it. No bitterness, no sermon. Just truth laid bare on a table between strangers. That night she couldn't sleep. The image of that couple haunted her, their quiet grief, their steady hands. They had every reason to hate her, yet they had fed her. In her world, mercy had always been a weakness. Here, it looked like strength. Days became weeks. The routine hardened into comfort. Dawn milking, field work, lunch at noon, evening tea. The rhythm of survival stripped away ideology. She stopped thinking like a prisoner and started thinking like a person who simply had things to do. When her old wound reopened, Mrs. Waywright noticed before she did. "Sit," the woman said, cleaning it with iodine that stung like fire. Greta winced. "Better it burns now than rots later," the farmer muttered. It sounded harsh, but it was care disguised as a discipline, the only language war survivors had left. By spring 1946, the camp guards had begun to vanish, one transfer at a time. The fences stayed, but they no longer mattered. Greta could walk half a mile to the post office unescorted. She always came back. The British seemed puzzled by her obedience, but she wasn't being obedient anymore. She was choosing stability over chaos. After so many years of orders, choice itself felt like rebellion. Then she met Thomas. He worked in the district administrative office where she'd been reassigned to help with records. A quiet man with round glasses and ink stains on his fingers, he spoke to her as if her accent didn't exist. "Miss Miller," he'd say, "could you file these under civilians? Relocated." Always Miss Miller, never prisoner. Small courtesies, invisible to everyone else, meant everything to her. Sometimes during tea breaks they talked, about weather, about books, once about guilt. "Do you ever think it will fade?" she asked. Thomas considered the question, eyes on his cup. "No," he said, "but maybe it stops ruling you." When his demobilization orders came, he stopped by her desk. "I'm going home," he said, "to Manchester." "Going to teach, maybe?" She nodded, unsure why her chest felt hollow. "Good," she said. "You'll be good at that." He smiled faintly. "Take care, Miss Muller." "Take care, Sergeant Thomas." He paused, corrected softly, "Just Thomas now." And then he was gone. That night she sat on her narrow bed, staring at her hands. The same hands that had once worn the Reich's armband, now ink-stained like his. Somewhere between surrender and survival, she had been rewritten. Autumn 1946. The British authorities began repatriation. Each woman was given a choice: return to Germany or apply for civilian residence if she had no home left to go to. Greta thought of Hamburg, streets flattened to rubble, her parents gone in the firestorm, her brother missing on the Eastern Front. She thought of the Waywrights' farm, of tea, of bread, of silence that didn't wound. When the officer asked, "Return or remain?" she said, "Remain." And just like that, she became a ghost who chose not to haunt the past. The years that followed were small and steady. She stayed with the Waywrights until their bones gave out, and their farm became hers in all but name. In 1952, she married a local mechanic, a kind, ordinary man who never asked too many questions. Ordinary, she discovered, was a miracle. Together they built a life of quiet rituals: morning tea, church on Sundays, letters from neighbors who never knew her history. Peace arrived not as forgiveness, but as routine. 17 years later, on a gray afternoon in 1962, Greta sat at her kitchen table while rain tapped gently on the window, an echo of another storm from another life. Her daughter, 12 and curious, looked up from her homework. "Mama," she asked, "were you scared when they captured you?" Greta smiled faintly. "Yes," she said, "but not for the reason you think." The girl frowned. "Why then?" "Because they were kind," Greta said. Her daughter laughed, confused. "How can that be scary?" Greta turned her cup slowly between her palms, watching the tea ripple. "Because kindness from an enemy makes you question everything you were taught to believe. And once you start questioning, you can never go back." She poured another cup for the girl. "Remember this," she said quietly. "How people treat you when they don't have to. That's who they really are." Outside, the rain kept falling, not heavy, just steady. The same sound she'd heard on the roof of that detention barrack 17 years earlier. She could almost smell the mud again, hear the sergeant's voice. "You'll want to sit. Processing takes time." He'd been right. Processing took a lifetime. History books would never mention women like Greta Mueller. They'd talk about generals, treaties, numbers, not about the prisoners who learned that mercy could wound deeper than hate, or the captors who understood that victory meant nothing if you lost your soul delivering it. She looked at her daughter, alive, safe, unburdened, and realized that somewhere between surrender and silence, humanity had quietly rebuilt itself, not through triumph, through restraint. The tea had long gone cold, but she didn't mind. Some things, she had learned, were meant to be savored even after the warmth was gone. And if anyone ever asked her what truly ended the war, she would not speak of bombs or treaties. She would say, "A cup of tea, offered by a man who refused to hate, because sometimes the strongest weapon in the world is the one you choose not to use."